Why don't we get started? Welcome to everyone that's joined. My name's Dave, and I am the founder of 10,000 Coffees. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a really important topic for me personally as an LGBTQ entrepreneur. Of course, always looking for how we can build more diversity, support allies to get involved with our community, and of course for all the diversity and equity communities. I think 2020 has really accelerated a lot of things for us, from the most decentralized workforce that we've ever been in, but also it's been a year where everybody has started to look for ways and opportunities to do more and get involved and actually turn intent into action. For those that don't know us at 10,000 Coffees, we help scale developmental experiences through equitable networks. I think for the history of time, if you look at what makes people successful and what makes people included in the workplace, it's really being connected to people and having the right conversations. And that's really what 10,000 Coffees does, is works with organizations so that whether it's virtual or at one point it was in person, we can help people have the right conversations to access those networks. We do this all over the world. So we do it with over 180 clients, over 50,000 students and early professionals to help build the bridges between people that are entering the workplace. And through all of this and what we've shared today is we have kind of a jam-packed agenda to walk you through some of the data that we've learned from, and ultimately how we can create connectivity and drive action around DE&I. I've got two of, I'd say, some of my favorite people that I get to work with here at 10,000 Coffees. Whenever we're thinking about new product ideas or how to scale equity and inclusion, Steve and Seton are among the people that I am texting and calling to run these ideas by. I'm going to give them a quick introduction, and then I'll let them say hello as well. But first is Steve Pae. Steve is from Ascend, is one of the most active people in the diversity and equity inclusion space across all of the Ascend member organizations, and also is also in his everyday life is not only an adjunct professor, but also at Goldman. I also have Seton, who is leading the Global Pride Network at Cigna, is actively involved in all different aspects of DE&I, and in his everyday work world is within the innovation team. I'll just turn it over to Steve to say a quick introduction, and then I'll pass it to Seton from there.
Great. Thank you, Dave, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today with Seton and yourself and 10,000 Coffees. I say hi to everyone. You know, everyone asks me, how do you juggle multiple things between Goldman Sachs, Ascend, and being a professor? And I'll share with people, the secret is, I think there is a connection with all three, you know, working with corporate, nonprofits, and education. And I'll talk a little bit about that more later during my talk, but welcome everyone, and nice meeting you all virtually.
Thanks, Steve. Seton.
And hi, everyone. Thanks, Dave, for having me. I'm Steven Goddard, like Dave said, and I work at Cigna, which is, you know, as I'm sure several people know, but just in case you don't, Cigna is one of the U.S.'s largest health services companies, where, as Dave said, I take on a couple different roles. And what we'll talk most today about is sort of my role helping to advance innovation within a really big organization in a space where there are lots and lots of problems to solve, and lots of opportunities to solve those problems through innovation. And so I'm excited to talk with you all and to talk a little bit about how we can use some of the connections that 10,000 Coffees creates to advance innovation, and how that has also sort of helped to apply the way that I think about my role as an ERG lead at Cigna as well. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's great. Yeah, we'll be jumping into kind of the perspective of ERG or BRG or diversity group leaders, and then also from a kind of executive sponsor perspective with Steve. And please do ask questions, drop them in the chat. We have some great questions that have come in advance, so I'll go through those as well, but we'll keep it really conversational over the next 50 minutes. So today we're going to be talking about readying for 2021. 2020, I think, was a surprise dress rehearsal for something that we didn't expect. How do we reapply that as we go into the next year? I'll be passing it over to Steve to talk around creating a culture of accountability. So much intent, I think, in so many performance management. It's about diversifying for succession, diversifying for perspectives. How do you create that accountability? And Steve will be able to speak through that. We'll also talk about data and measurement with Seton. There's no shortage of data that Seton is seeing through the innovation team, but how we can actually leverage kind of innovation programs that can actually inspire our diversity groups. And then we'll have a virtual coffee, almost as though we're in real life together, all in one spot, where we'll have an open dialogue between the three of us and be opening it up for Q&A. Please do introduce yourself using the chat, use the Q&A function throughout the call. And just as a reminder, the session will be recorded, and we'll share this with everyone, for you and for anybody at the office that might not have been able to make it. It's incredible to see the people that have joined us today. We have people from all over the world, all different types of organizations, people from diversity teams, leads of employee resource groups, and employees who are looking just to do more, and executive sponsors. So a really diverse group. So excited to have all of you join us today. I think, if any of you joined our last webinar where we had our attendees, there's no shortage of data to continuously remind us that teams that have diverse perspectives and connectivity perform better. They always have, they always will. It's now a matter of how we get people off the bench and actually drive those strategies. We know that there's a disconnect where 10% of business leaders say they're not frequently communicating about D&I, but the messages are not getting through. There's this gap between what people think they're communicating around and engaging, and what end employees actually think are happening. And so often at the top, we have a lot of this goal and motivation, but those end employees are not getting access to the programs or to the actual connections that matter. So how do we get the organization off the bench? Think about all of the people in your organization who are allies, or now in the performance goals, they're looking to diversify their teams and perspectives. How do we do that when we don't have events to send them to? We can't have them walk the hallways and just meet new people. New diverse employees can't meet those same people to create those sticky networks when they join, to ultimately help create accountability and action. So I've had the pleasure of working with Steve for a good 2 years now, whether it's with Ascend or Goldman, or just thinking about how product can create a virtual way for people to have those informal networks and mentoring conversations. I'm going to let Steve kind of speak to some of his experiences. And again, please do ask questions. I'll be taking a look, and we'll open up for those questions during our Q&A. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. I just want to lead with a quote. I do wear multiple hats, and today the primary hat I wear is for Ascend. Ascend offers a way for leaders to turn intent into immediate action. I love that quote because throughout this year, specifically because of the environment and the pandemic, we as leaders wanted to make sure that we all connected. But like Dave said, how do you connect when you can't just have coffee with somebody, or physically, or have lunch? You can't really bump into people, and I call that creative friction that we talk about, especially at Goldman Sachs and many of the innovative companies. So, one of the things that we turn to is specific products or technology that we can actually leverage in this virtual world, that we can create that friction and opportunity to really innovate and come together. We just wanted to share that we did talk with David and 10,000 Coffees early in the year before the pandemic, even to just create that physical connection and have people come together. But we realized over this course of this year, being a difficult year as is, that Ascend and 10,000 Coffees and some of the products that we've been offering to our sponsors and our members have been innovative, and they've also allowed our leaders and our members to kind of go back to their companies, because our members, which are tens of thousands of members across Canada as well as US. I sit on the board of Ascend for the US entity, and I've been with Ascend for about 8 years now, sitting on the board and working on various initiatives. But I do see that our opportunity to really create some of these products and really roll them out in a closed environment has offered the opportunity for leaders, whether they're ERG leaders, whether they are business leaders, whether they're just members of an organization that are very in tune and supporting D&I initiatives, have really allowed them to create that accountability. So I think the best way to describe some of this is to just give you a couple of examples. So I started with a couple of examples that I could share with you here. So these are some real use cases that we've been working with some of the top companies of the world. One of the top 5 global professional service firms wanted to create accountability for not just their members and their ERG, but for their management team all the way up to the CEO. So they actually contacted Ascend, and this was during the time of the early phases of the pandemic, where they were seeing a lot of, and employees were concerned about some of the bias actions that were taking place in the community, especially against Asian Americans. So they contacted Ascend because they knew Ascend has a critical leadership space in this environment, and they asked us, what can you do? How do we create this accountability all the way, from executive to the CEO, all the way to our individual members? So we worked with this professional services organization, now top 5, 40 billion in revenue annually, I believe last year. And we worked with them to create a program where we both created accountability for the management team, where each of their managing directors have agreed to sign up for specific programming that would be allow them to really understand the perspectives of Asian Americans, but also other ERGs, and held the CEO accountable. It was great because it was all live. I participated in as well with the company. It was all live and created that accountability for the CEO to take immediate action and support the organization as a whole to have this D&I training, which was specific for the Asian bias and some of the allyship that we needed to get done, they needed to get done. So we engaged with them, as well as there was a commitment to support the local community that were being most hurt, the vulnerable communities. A lot of that, are communities of color. So they had a commitment there to provide, funding as well as volunteer hours for those different communities. And Ascend happened to be one of the recipients of that donation as well. So, and then they're rolling out programs within their organization that Ascend helped develop for the ERGs and their managing directors. So I'm really proud of that opportunity with this top 5 global professionals firm to provide that. The other example I want to tell you is something that was kind of surprised me, because there are still large organizations out there that have not fully developed their ERGs or BRGs. They're kind of coming up to speed. And their organizations now, especially their management, are wanted accountability for not just themselves, but the organization in terms of having best practices and really putting the leadership behind, both in dollars and time, around some of the ERG development. So they came to Ascend. Ascend is a leader in the ERG space, especially for Asian Americans, to understand what other companies are doing. What are some of the best practices they have? So we worked with them to help them formulate an Asian ERG for the first time. They had other ERGs, but they really didn't have the Asian ERG. And we worked with them to put together programs, some learnings. The learnings included not just for the ERG members, but the ERG leaders and the executive sponsors, what they should be looking at, how they should be thinking about the ERGs. How can the ERGs really help the company as well? So proud of that example, because one of the core strengths of Ascend is to help promote ERGs and get them accelerated through the ERG maturity process. We have a lot of different companies that have been with Ascend over the last 15 years of existence, hundreds of companies, and some of them have very advanced ERGs. One I'll mention right now, because it's on everyone's mind, is Pfizer. Pfizer have been a long supporter of Ascend, and obviously, we're very hopeful about the vaccine that they're coming out, but they've been a long supporter of Ascend, and they've been a leader in their ERG practice. They are actually working with us to create a program for all ERG leaderships and executive sponsors right now to share some of the best practices of what a business executive sponsor could be doing for their ERG. So very proud to talk about that. And last but not least, we also had the global pharmaceutical firm, similar to the other example where they wanted to make sure that they kick off a right ERG for their Asian community. So in terms of leveraging Ascend for 360-degree accountability, this slide really, the way I think about it is, how do you actually create accountability for yourself, for your team, and your management? In Ascend, we have various programs, leadership programs. We have our allies coming together, allyship program. We have specific professional development programs. We have a whole life cycle of communities, whether you're a student, whether you're a young professional or you're a professional or an executive or a board member of a Fortune 500 company, where we actually create opportunities for you to volunteer and really get that accountability, because many of us have accountability actions as part of our professional jobs as well. In terms of your teams, whether you're part of an ERG network, whether you're volunteering for an Ascend chapter, Ascend has over 18 professional chapters in major cities across the US and Canada. You can definitely volunteer and gain some of the skills and create that accountability where your management team is asking you to really get involved in D&I. And then finally, for your management team, like I mentioned, for this top 5 professional service firm, we offered executive programs. We offered something new this year, the Chief Diversity Officers program, where all the Chief Diversity Officers across over 100 Fortune 500 companies came together. We developed a program for them with their input, sharing really best practices. And that actually created really good ideas for each other, all the Chief Diversity Officers, to have specific action items that they want to take back to their organization and create accountability for themselves. And then finally, we launched our AEN network, our Asian Executive Network. I'll talk a little bit more about that, because that AEN network provided an opportunity for us to really share a network that can have our executives really have a platform, in this case, 10,000 Coffees, to really share their learnings and knowledge and mentorship to the rest of the population. Next slide. I think I want to just highlight a few things, and Dave, please feel to jump in here. What we started this year was awesome. I mean, we started with student Ascend Cafes, where we had mentoring programs, one-to-many. I kicked it off this year by hosting the first one, but now we had 26 throughout the year. We had our virtual conference, Ascended, for the first time this year. And one of the highlights was all of the different mentoring Ascend Cafes that we did. I think we did, probably over 10 or a dozen during the virtual conference in August and September. And all the feedback and the ratings you can see here. Our next step is really to scale this up over the next year. Really have each of our chapters, our professional chapters across North America, and our student chapters. We have over 50 student chapters. Really take the helm and run these for the students as well as the professionals, and give the AEN members, and they've been asking for Asian Executive Networks. These are people that are C-level or 2 levels from C-level to qualify. They really wanted opportunity to really have a platform and a voice to our membership to create this accountability and offer their insights. Like I said, we want to scale this up. We think it's been great in terms of having impact. This also helps us create the business case that a lot of our sponsors are asking for in terms of how do you measure impact of some of your programs. So I think 10,000 Coffees, with the data that they provide and what we've learned so far, is helping us to measure that impact. Next slide. Just in closing, these are some of the topics covered throughout the year. And they covered a combination of career management, specific topics around the pandemic, but these are all well received, and we've had oversubscription for a lot of these events. We try to keep them intimate and small. So next year, we're gonna do a lot more of these, where each of our chapters are gonna commit to doing several throughout the year. So thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity, Dave, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great, and congrats on your results. And to Steve's point, fortunately, their organization had built the foundation where, when in March everything went remote, it was just a flip of the switch. And any of the executive sponsors from the different organizations were able to just do their virtual mentoring or networking all just through their Ascend 10,000 Coffees program. Not every organization was that ready, and so 2020 has been a really nonstop year for our team to get everybody onto those virtual programs, given how executive sponsors, their direct teams, people managers want to build those connections, but currently, they don't have that. So congrats on all the results. So next I'll introduce you to Seton. As I shared, and I think as you go through Q&A, definitely ask Seton all the questions. He's been at the helm of DE&I for since I don't even know how long, Seton, since like high school at least, and is now doing that at Cigna, but also leading some really exciting work within innovation and learning. So with that, I'll pass it over to Seton.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So if you want to jump to the next, great. Okay, there's a little lag on my end. Sorry about that. So I think, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the way that we have thought about the importance of creating connections and the value of creating connections is really about advancing innovation and doing so through those casual connections, because we have sort of this fundamental belief that's the way those things happen. And so the thing that I put on the page here is kind of another guiding principle that we use, which is, putting the human back in healthcare requires a critical starting point, and that's human conversations. So, to add a little bit of context, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but I think, certainly in the American healthcare system, but in other places around the world, there are a lot of people who are very smart and who know a lot about healthcare and who know a lot about medicine and who know a lot about how to help people. What seems to get missed in so many instances when we think about how to solve the problems that plague us now is actually sitting down and talking to patients, actually sitting down and talking to people about their experiences trying to access healthcare. And so a big tenet of the way that we advance innovation at Cigna is by having conversations with patients. So if we want to jump to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about what that means. So in order to do that, we use a methodology or a discipline called design thinking or human-centered design. And I'm sure that people on this call are familiar with this or have heard of it. In case you're not, I would say, a quick history lesson is that this is a methodology or a discipline that has existed for a very long time, but is really kind of coming into prominence now. This is something that more and more organizations are starting to recognize the value in and the importance of. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about and investing in at Cigna is the reality that innovation happens when we really understand unmet needs that exist in a marketplace. And that's not unmet needs that we invent to build a new product. That's not things that we think would be really cool to be able to sell to people. That's things that people, through their behaviors and our conversations with them, demonstrate that they don't have a solution for right now and we could provide. And so the way you get to that and the way you understand what those things are and sort of build and test those things, we believe the best way to get there is through human-centered design. And one of the things that we observed in our organization is that human-centered design and innovation was happening in pockets. So Cigna, if you talked to me 2 years ago, I would have said Cigna's got 35,000 employees. 2 years ago, just about, we closed a deal acquiring another company that more than doubled Cigna's employee population. And so overnight, we went from having what felt like disparate pockets of people working on different forms of innovation and doing different kinds of things to twice as many people doing that. And a huge population of people who already didn't necessarily know each other because we had so many employees, to an even larger population of people who didn't know each other, didn't know how to work together. All of those kinds of challenges that come when you try to integrate to different companies or organizations. And so for us, it was important last year, certainly, that we find a way to start making these connections. And I think one of the things that, if you want to jump to the next slide, you can, Dave. I think one of the things that was, you know, that set us up well for 2020 is that more than half of the people who work at Cigna were already working from home full time. And there was an even sort of, you know, if you count the people who work from home, you know, from time to time, or even most of the time, but still have a desk in an office, you're talking about a really large portion of the Cigna employee population who was working from home. And so all over the country, right, and all over the world, frankly. And so, you know, for when we think about innovation in sort of the innovation center of excellence in the team, we also think that innovation happens when, you know, people kind of walk up to each other and start talking about something and start talking about an idea and say, hey, what if we did this? Or what if we tried that? Or, you know, I've been thinking about this problem. What could we do about that? And suddenly, right, 2020 hits and we are not having those conversations anymore. And on top of that, all of our programs that are designed to help people learn how to do human-centered design and learn how to have meaningful conversations with patients to understand their needs, those weren't happening anymore. And so they were happening virtually, they were happening in disconnected ways, but we still wanted to make sure that we were doing the work of connecting these efforts, connecting people internally, and advancing a dialogue about innovation and about how to help our customers. And so what we did was we set up cafes for everybody who had gone through this training program. It's a training program that lasts about 10 weeks, where they go through sort of every phase of the design process and practice it and learn it and get feedback on it. And they work on a real project that they actually have, and that they were, you know, accountable for delivering to the organization. And so we set up cafes for these people to be able to interact with each other. They didn't all know each other. They didn't all know what they were working on. They hadn't all been part of the same sort of cohort of people. But we also wanted to make sure that the folks who were out there doing this work were having a chance to actually interact with senior leaders who would get to make decisions about the thing that they were trying to build, and would actually get a chance to interact with them and understand how they think about innovation and how they try to advance innovation within their teams or the organization, or part of the organization that they own. And so we did that a few ways. One was, you know, these leader-led events, right? So we had senior leaders at Cigna, and even slightly less senior, but really well-versed in methods and the discipline of design thinking, come to talk with employees about how do we use this at Cigna? How is this used more broadly in the market? How are competitors using this? What are some specific tools that you can use in your job today to use this methodology and help advance innovation? And so the result was that we had a really high degree of participation. We didn't have, this is a small group of people who are going through these exercises and who are participating. We had over 170 attendees. And everybody who left those rated them very highly. And so, you know, the thing that we start to think about when we say, okay, where do we go from here? Part of it is continuing to use this as a way of advancing innovation. Part of it is also as a way, you know, along the way we've recognized, hey, there are really meaningful connections being made internally between people who are in disparate parts of the organization, disparate parts of the world, and even sort of disparate levels within the organization, right? And so people who may never actually have exposure to some really senior leaders are getting that. And because of that, there's some real value in saying, how do we start working with our diverse populations, like, for instance, the ERG that I lead, to start connecting them to people who are making decisions about hiring and people who are able to coach them and help them grow in their careers. And so, you know, I think that's sort of where we hope to take this over time.
Yeah, congrats. It's been, I think there's so many parallels for everybody that's on this webinar. Think about all the different pockets of diversity groups and of initiatives to try to create more inclusion and more DE&I. Imagine you could connect those all together. And there's just so many parallels between that and the innovation world at any organization, where it's all living in decentralized pockets that have only become more decentralized in this last year. And so I'm excited to draw some parallels between those two, especially as you wear the hat of the lead of the Pride ERG globally, as well as the design thinking practice. I know these are just some of the topics that Seton had covered off, so we can skip through these, but feel free in the Q&A if you have questions. This is kind of the content and thought starters of experiences. Seton, I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to add to on top of this.
No, I think maybe one thing I would add here is that I would say that as we brought sort of two large organizations together, this became a really important way for us to also give people from legacy organizations an opportunity to understand how the other legacy organization thought about an advanced design and innovation, and how they and gave them an introduction to senior leaders in this new co who they may not have gotten to know or understand what their role is. And so those were sort of really helpful, not just in terms of like, here's how we use design thinking or here's how we advance innovation, but in terms of like, let me help you grow in terms of your organizational savvy and agility. And so I think all of those things kind of came through in these events.
Okay, I think I think everybody on this call is probably in a reorganization or restructuring or a merger or bringing two companies together, and all of that use case to create inclusive networks and help those organizations onboard in that way is going to be a real opportunity in the year ahead. So excited to jump into a Q&A, and as though we're again all together to be able to jump into these conversations. I think one of the first questions that came in that is interesting is, Seton, to start with you talked around how these employees are going through training, they're learning so much, and then after the training, they're all kind of in dispersed places all around the world. A lot of people are putting employees through bias training and diversity training. We see hundreds or thousands of people managers going through this in the next few months to become better leaders. What parallels or advice would you have from what you've seen from an innovation training perspective that talent and business leaders can think of as they train so many people on the formal aspects of DE&I?
That's such a great question. I think that sort of a large part of our thinking around around trying to create these connections between people for the sake of advancing innovation was people would go through these 10-week experiences, have support all along the way to say, yes, what you are doing is a non-traditional way of approaching a business problem, but you're doing it the right way. Keep doing that, keep doing that. And then they would get back to their roles and they would have to go back to doing things the same way that they always did them. And so one of the things that was important to us was we wanted to create an outlet for people to continue building the skills that they learned there, so that they were actually actively engaging with people who were also working on building those skills, and people who were actively working on finding ways to do these things in their daily lives and not make it this thing that happened in training, but that didn't happen in their regular job. And so, I think that is one of the places where it's seen to be most effective and probably translates most effectively, is that this, I think for us, this is about more than creating some connections and having people chat. This is about talking about something that is important to our organization and frankly our customers, our patients, and really pushing them sort of through these ongoing conversations to continue using what they're learning and to continue thinking of new ways to integrate it into their work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's this stat is somewhere around 90% of learning is forgotten within 30 days unless they have those informal collisions to reinstate it, those boosters that you need. And it's been incredible to see what it's done from design thinking, especially if you're the only design thinking person of a team of 50 or 100 people. Sometimes it's pretty lonely, and so to have that practice area is such a great way to reapply. And the same thing will exist for people managers. They're going to go through this training. How do you keep them engaged and in that knowledge so that they can approach and apply more effectively? Another question, Steve, I'll start with you on this is, imagine you're a director of talent with a focus on DE&I, and you've got 20 to 30 executive sponsors of all the different diversity groups, and then you've got 50 to 100 people managers that have goals around diversifying their talent pipeline and getting more engaged with diverse talent, but there's no events to connect them with those early or mid-career talent to build those bridges. What are some of the things that you would recommend to help do that in this more remote, decentralized workplace?
Yes, thanks, Dave. And these are real, live use cases actually that I've heard of and I've experienced as part of Ascend. Organizations definitely, they're looking for rich content. They're looking for things that are, not new, but they don't have to invent it because there's a lot of good content and learning from other organizations as well. So the way Ascend really helps in these type of organizations is to pull in other, I would say, organizations that have more advanced ERGs or they have developed a program and leveraging those platforms as well. So I can share with you that Ascend had brokered an opportunity with an organization that really was in the situation you mentioned, and we offered a couple of different opportunities for that organization to connect with other organizations and having leveraging platforms like 10,000 Coffees and having these sessions across organizations. So that's been very popular, and the way that we did that was through the Ascend, being able to convene them together. That's one. I think the other thing is that these leaders that have D&I accountability, like you mentioned, from the executive office, they're really looking for ideas, new ideas that they want to host, either social events, learning events, and now professional development events. And those professional development events are specific things that most organizations have asked them. You should have at least a couple of weeks of development that you should have as part of your performance planning. So most individuals in these companies look for opportunities to learn new skills, whether they're technical, whether they're business skills. But what we're seeing also is opening up the category of different learnings to also D&I training. And although a lot of the organizations do have D&I training internally, they do want to supplement that with D&I informal training with other organizations, whether it's other ERGs, other D&I organizations. So I would definitely offer up the opportunity for these organizations, like you mentioned, to work with outside organizations like Ascend and work through them to be connected with other organizations that have programming that they can leverage and speakers that they can leverage as well.
That's great. And a question for both of you. I think things are going to be different in 2021. We've seen NASDAQ announce how diversity at the board level is going to be mandatory. Is the idea of connection with colleagues, is that a nice to do thing? Is that a need to do thing? How does that fit onto the scorecards? And how does that actually tie back to kind of the business critical nature of an everyday busy professional? Like, what's that business case? Or how are you seeing that actually being tied back to performance management? Maybe I'll start with Seton and then pass it to Steve.
Yeah, so I think that I can sort of only speak for my own organization and the way that we're thinking about some of these challenges. I think that for us, there's a real emphasis first on really understanding how some of the diversity, inclusion, and equity issues that exist in the world manifest in our four walls, and starting to think deeply about that and go after those things. And so I think that for a lot of organizations, I think a lot of organizations have said for many, many years that they really care deeply about creating diversity, equity, and inclusion in their workplaces. I think that 2020 has been a year when folks have been sort of forced to take a step back and say, well, we're saying these things, but what are the actual actions that we're putting behind them? And what are the actual actions that we're taking to advance these things in our organization, and we care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but this isn't, thankfully, it's not true of Cigna, but lots of organizations, right? We look and everybody who leads the organization is white. Everybody who leads it is white and male or whatever, right? And so, but they still care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so for us, I think one of the things that we've spent time talking about is thinking about why, what are we doing to take a look at sort of our organizational structure and, looking in sort of specific parts of the organization and saying, how do we start to advance these really talented people who have been overlooked for one reason or another? I think those are sort of the kind of small steps that organizations are taking internally right now. And I think that those things don't happen until until real connections are made, right? That's a big part of what we're thinking about is how do we really connect, not just like we all go to the same event, but how do we get our diverse employees to interact with other diverse leaders who look like them or who are like them, but also people who aren't. And so we can rely on those sort of allies or members of these individual communities to advance those folks. So those are, sort of all over the place thoughts, but a few things that come to mind for me.
Yep.
I think really connecting is an emphasis, and I'll pass it to Steve from there, but really connecting those diverse people with leaders is actually going to be on their scorecard, whether they have the right mix on their teams. Steve, what advice would you have? I know you've designed matching algorithms to match people together using the 10,000 Coffees program, but what would be your advice to any organization who's trying to build those bridges between people managers and hiring managers and those disparate groups of talent to make sure that those succession pathways are built?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. You just reminded me of a funny thing. I've designed those matching algorithms on your platform for people, but in real life, I designed matching algorithms to match equity trades and matching engines. So I could draw some parallels there. I would definitely say a couple of things to your question. One is what we found, just understanding the environment, because we have access to a lot of corporate America, as they are looking for diversity at their board level, diversity at their C-suite level. What we're finding is that for leaders, knowing, understanding and work and being familiar with racial and D&I issues is a leadership skill that's coming out to be more and more important. We think of leadership skills as being able to have a firm grip around the organization, maybe expert skills, networking skills, but specifically D&I and being able to work with a diverse population is becoming a leadership skill and something that people are recognizing at the top. So they want people to develop these skills, just like developing any other skill. And to do that, I think organizations right now probably don't have all the tools that they wish they had. So they're looking for opportunities where they can have both formal training as well as informal training. And I think the formal training is something that I know that Ascend is trying to address, specifically around some of their Asian Directors Academy, where we're trying to get Asian Americans and Asian leaders ready for board level positions, because we see a demand coming for more diverse board members. So we want to be able to address the supply. Secondly, I do think that my advice to these organizations again is you don't have to solve everything on your own. There are other organizations that have solved it and have some best practices, and leveraging organizations like Ascend to really bridge that between the organizations so they can actually take some of the best practices. That's what we see right now, because more people are turning to their network, their informal network that they've built over time, and now they're more aggressively building through platforms like yourself, so that they have access to some of the key learnings and best practices from other organizations.
Yeah, that's such a great one. And I think kind of double clicking on that, a question that came in is, and I think it's kind of what you're alluding to, Steve, in some ways, is around the difference between diversity and inclusion, and whether a lot of leaders think once they've hired and onboarded the person that asked the question is like, then they're done. But There's so much more that has to take place. what does that look like in your eyes in terms of how to actually create inclusion, the difference of that, and even how that skill set has to be built to make sure inclusion takes hold?
Yeah, great point. You know, a lot of leaders that are kind of new in the space, they think it's a recruiting issue, right? I just have to hit the numbers, and it's definitely not the recruiting issue. I could also talk about it's a retention issue, but it's also a growth issue. You know, how do you get these diverse leaders, but actually provide the support so they can stay in the company and grow them as leaders themselves? So along the entire journey, whether it's recruiting, retention, providing them professional development opportunities, providing them opportunities to even outside of their role to volunteer at an ERG or even outside of their company to develop these skills, is what good leaders and good managers have to now think about in terms of, you know, promoting diversity within their organization. And lastly, you know, to my previous point, how do these diverse individuals also themselves think about diversity? You know, we just naturally think that because you're diverse, you're gonna know everything about diversity. That's not true. I could tell you for a fact that when, you know, we had the Black Lives Matter and we wanted to figure out how to support, you know, those affected cultures, we really, like the Asian Americans, really came together and thought about, hey, how comfortable are we to talk about race? How comfortable are we to reach across the table and work with other ERGs? We found out that we were not that comfortable. We were not that race conversant, we call it. So we had to actually help, you know, our Asian American leaders really become comfortable and really understand why they're uncomfortable today and how to become race conversant. So I do think that, you know, I want to point out that just because you're a part of a diverse population doesn't mean that you know everything about diversity and inclusion. They themselves need training too.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's something that, you know, we all have to, you know, practice. And even for me within the LGBT community, I'm always trying to figure out how I converse and be more comfortable to speak up. And you know, we all there's a lot of opportunities there. What for both Seton and Steve, maybe we'll start with Seton first, is diversity groups are widespread. There's lots of participants, there's leaders, executives. What are some of the tactical advice for somebody who's kind of thinking about their 2021 programming to be able to reach scale and impact given the new normal?
Yeah, I think that in sort of the ERG that I lead, I say there are a couple things. One is that it's happening sort of in the realm of ERGs, and I have a couple things I'll say there. And then there's stuff that has to happen outside of ERGs, and you know, I'll talk a little bit about that too quickly. You know, I think in terms of the Pride ERG, using that as an example, a big emphasis for us this going into next year, given that we know that we will be, you know, even though we were already fairly kind of geographically disconnected, we know that it's unlikely that we will have a year when we can all get together as a leadership team and you know, plan the year out, right? And so for us, and it's also unlikely perhaps that we'll be able to advance a lot of things that require kind of having people in person, people present together. And so, you know, as we think about 2021, one of the things for us has been, how do we identify people who are leaders in the organization, who have a lot of organizational savvy, I know I've used that term a couple times today, and who have the ability to sort of take, you know, a thing that we really care about getting done in this year and get it across the finish line. And I know that's like a pretty basic thing, but for the how that's looked is, you know, we've had to sort of look across the organization and say, what are the things that we want to advance, and can we find functional people who, if we said, hey, we want to fix this problem like today, they would be able to get it done. And it wouldn't take sort of navigating 55 steps around the organization to get it done. And so I'd say that's sort of the, you know, how we're thinking about it. And so in some cases, you know, that means thinking deeply about, like, we've got people who are in leadership roles now in the ERG who care a lot about this, but are they best positioned to advance the things we want to advance, or could they be helpful in other ways? And so there's been a little bit of a realignment going on, as we figure out the best people to kind of advance initiatives. I think in the organization overall, for outside of ERGs, you know, Cigna has over 120 million patient and customer relationships around the world. If our organization does not look like the people we serve, that doesn't necessarily bode well for the way that we build products and serve these populations, right? And so for you know, sort of outside of that, there's got to be, and you know, we're working quite a bit on this, is like supporting, you know, doing the work of improving conditions in communities of color, reducing the systemic racism that exists in our healthcare system. Those things don't happen by treating those issues as things that the company foundation handles. They happen when they become a part of our strategy and a part of the way that we work and a part of the way that we do business. And so, you know, there's part of this sort of where I started with ERG, part of it is like, how do we use the ERG to push the organization in that direction and help them understand how we have to think about these things?
Yep. And I'll just add to Seton. I think Seton did a great job explaining. The only thing I'll add is we're definitely hearing from, you know, from what I'm seeing from Ascend, working with Fortune 500 companies, is how to help ERGs create a community, not just within their ERG, given the new normal of virtual, but how do they create a community virtually with the other ERGs, and then ultimately with other ERGs and other companies, right? And this is a big connection problem, right? Matching problem to solve. And, you know, Ascend is trying really hard to think about this as well. I think at scale, you know, you need to bring in the right technology, you know, kind of the frictionless way of having people connect. Once you get into people connecting from one organization to another, then you kind of get into, you know, compliance and legal and information security as well. So we're seeing that from my preview. But I do think that ultimately what, you know, the new normal right now has taught us is there is a way to build community through a virtual environment that will be lasting even after we come out of this pandemic. And that actually has advantages beyond just building a community physically. So those advantages I think are going to serve us well as we figure out a solution of building that community at multiple levels, organizations to organizations, you know, within an organization, within their ERG networks. And I think, quite frankly, you know, the person that figures it out or the company that figures it out is going to be way ahead of the game, because this is something that with D&I leaders and CDOs, they really want to figure out as well, because they understand that it's not just, you know, one ERG's problem to solve, it's across all ERGs, and even, you know, with their peers across companies, you know, cross-company problem to solve.
Yeah, the data point around that is such a big one to help people get the visibility into the data of how it's all going. And another question that came in is just how did bringing technology in help create a data and visibility that you didn't have before? What did that look like, and how did it help? Maybe Steve, I'll start with you, then pass to Seton.
Yeah, no, this is a great question, because, you know, before we had the technology like 10,000 coffees and other technologies that we're using, really when companies, you know, come to Ascend as an example, they really want to know the impact. Like, what's the impact of your programs? What's the impact of your networking sessions or your learning or your convention? And a lot of it, you know, a lot of it was qualitative, not quantitative. And quite frankly, now organizations want quantitative numbers, and we've been able to provide that with platforms like 10,000 Coffee, because now we can measure people, you know, coming into a platform. We can measure, we can understand, you know, what kind of questions they provided, how many questions they actually spoke up on, you know, different keywords. So these are all the things that I think organizations are now looking for even more and more to justify spending the dollars, you know, even above and beyond what they have today to help with their D&I efforts. You know, as a real example, you know, I got a request from one of our Ascend directors asking, how do we quantify specific outcomes for members that took Ascend training like 15 years ago, right? And where they are in their career today. And how do we quantify that so that we can actually present to top organizations? And we're talking about, like, you know, probably the top 3 biggest organizations in the world, understand, have them really help sponsor Ascend going forward. So, you know, I think it's even more so where I talked about building community and building a platform for that. having that data to justify that business case is going to become even more important.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that in sort of this other realm I'm playing in the innovation world. In that, you know, as we invest a lot in helping people become, you know, strong practitioners of human-centered design, you know, there have been moments where we sit around and we say, wait a minute, is this actually doing anything? Like, are we, is this place becoming more innovative? Are we actually putting new products out? And we are, but you know, I think for us, you know, the question becomes, is that a result of our investment in people, and in giving them these tools and equipping them with this competency? And what 10,000 Coffees sort of provided was evidence that it does in a lot of ways. There is a real investment on the part of lots and lots of people in bringing this discipline and methodology to life in their everyday work. And, you know, I think we hear that anecdotally, or we hear about a project that, you know, got across the finish line and is out in market. But again, that's sort of anecdotal. This brought an insight into just how deeply engaged and interested people are in advancing innovation in our organization.
Yeah, I love it. And I think something that you and I have kind of nerded out on is just the potential of that same extension of impact applied to DE&I training and learning, and making sure that it's activating. Because I mean, it's been so exciting to see how that's activated around design thinking, and there's so many parallels for those that are on the webinar. So with that, we are at time. I think, you know, the challenge to everyone here as you kind of go back to your office and think of next steps is, how do you actually leverage systems to create equity? And the other is, you know, how do we take that strategy and actually hold it accountable to different people to enable these informal experiences, just like we might enable people to take things like compliance training. Because until people kind of have that accountability, those strategies, the goals that we're hearing be announced by boards all over the world just will not happen. So with that, a huge thank you to Steve and Seton. I always enjoy our one-on-ones, and I'm so glad we can bring this to people all over the world to think about this in their organizations. Please do jump onto LinkedIn. You can find Seton and Steve there. Hit them up with more questions. And with that, have a great day, and hopefully everyone's winding down for the holiday season.
Yes, thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.